And next, I will pass it over to our interpreters, Aldo and Anais, who will be supporting us throughout this event so they can share the interpretation announcement and instructions.
Thank you. Saludos, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Los organizadores del evento de hoy tienen la firme determinación de crear un espacio multilingüe y con esa finalidad contamos con interpretación disponible al español e inglés. Les pedimos a todos los participantes que hablen despacio y en voz alta y clara en sus micrófonos para facilitar la interpretación. En breve activaremos la interpretación para este evento y si usted está usando la aplicación Zoom podrá ver el icono de un mundo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla o de 3 puntitos. Haga clic en el mundo para escuchar la interpretación y seleccione español. Si tiene algún problema con esto, por favor escriba un comentario en el chat. Muchas gracias. Hello, good evening. The organizers of today's event have made a strong commitment to creating a bilingual space. And to that end, we have interpretation available in Spanish and English. We ask that all participants speak slowly, loud and clear into their microphones to make interpretation easier. In a moment, we will activate the interpretation for this event and you'll see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen. To listen to interpretation, please click on the globe and select English. If you have any problems doing this, please comment in the chat box. Thank you.
Give people just a minute to select their interpretation options. Okay, thank you, Aldo and Anais, and welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, How to Build a Fair and Welcoming New Jersey, Introducing the Values Act. My name is Farrin Anello. I'm a senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, and I'm filling in today for my wonderful colleague, Amika Chalia, who has led the planning for this event. I'm so pleased to be joined by our incredible panel of immigrants' rights partners who will be sharing their expertise with us. We will discuss how we can build a fair and welcoming New Jersey for all residents, regardless of immigration status. In particular, we'll be discussing newly introduced legislation called the Values Act. This is a bill that aims to build confidence in state and local public agencies and to end New Jersey's participation in the federal detention and deportation machine. This legislation was introduced by Assemblyperson Raj Mukherjee and Senator Joseph Cryan. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the Values Act. This legislation prohibits state and local law enforcement from enforcing federal immigration law to the extent permitted by federal law. It prevents local resources from being used for federal immigration enforcement. It eliminates carve-outs in the Immigrant Trust Directive, New Jersey Immigrant Trust Directive, that exclude immigrants entangled in the criminal legal system and disproportionately harm Black and Brown New Jerseyans due to racial disparities in policing and prosecution. It protects our personal information by limiting the data that public agencies, including hospitals and public schools, can collect. It requires model policies for public schools, healthcare facilities, libraries, and shelters to ensure that people feel safe seeking public services. And it builds accountability and transparency for law enforcement through annual public reporting requirements. I'm now going to ask some questions to our panelists. Each panelist will have will give a brief answer to this question, and I'm going to pause just before each question to introduce the panelist. So first, our first question is for Amy Torres, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. Amy is Executive Director of NJAIJ, the largest membership-based immigrant coalition in our state, which is comprised of over 45 groups that span labor, faith, policy, community-based, and grassroots organizations. So Amy, New Jersey is home to over 2 million immigrants. They constitute 29% of the workforce and almost 20% of voting-aged citizens. Yet, despite the fact that so many immigrants call the state home, there is much work to do to ensure that New Jersey is truly fair and welcoming for all. Can you share your vision of what a fair and welcoming New Jersey looks like, what progress has been made towards this, and what next steps the state must take to ensure that immigrant communities can thrive.
Thank you so much, Farrin. And it's such a privilege and a pleasure to be part of today's panel alongside our member organizations. I know many more of us are in the audience and even more still in the movement. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about the Values Act today. Farrin, you're exactly right. Immigrant communities and communities of color have grown tremendously over the last 2 decades. As a state, we are more diverse than we've ever been, not just in population percentage, but in racial and ethnic diversity. The numbers that we see today aren't just inbound growth either. That's a common misconception and at times an intentional distraction, especially from reactionary or regressive pundits or those who pay attention to things like van surveys. That growth also includes second-generation immigrant kids, even adult immigrant kids who stay here, who raise their families here into 3rd and 4th generations, because for them, New Jersey is home. But we're not always a fair and welcoming state to everyone here. 1 in 4 New Jerseyans is foreign born, and 60% of kids come from an immigrant family. Those are huge numbers, but when people think of immigrant states, they immediately name California, Florida, New York, Texas, Arizona, right? No one ever says New Jersey. And if you would take a look at our state's public policy priorities, you'd think that the legislature didn't really know it either. We've begun making really important strides as a state, often after long fought battles, to expand access and eligibility for key programs, whether that's covering all kids in healthcare, status neutral driver or occupational licenses, pandemic relief, tuition and school aid. We're making progress, yes, but what is incremental progress when we're starting from so very far behind? And can that progress have its intended impact when generation upon generation, New Jerseyans are fearful that accessing these programs could result in very real consequences for a loved one? If you've read the Political Digest in the months since November's election, there's been this return to kitchen table issues. You've heard our governor say it. We heard our Assembly Speaker say it just earlier this week. They say we're only prioritizing issues that families talk about at the kitchen table. Well, in a state where, again, 1 in 4 kitchen table seats is held by someone who's a foreign-born resident, when 60% of the kids' table comes from an immigrant household, guess what? Every single issue before the legislature is an immigrant justice issue. Housing is an immigrant issue. Health and the care economy, issues for immigrant patients and workers alike. Jobs, small businesses, schools, higher education, nutrition and food scarcity, big topics of conversation this week. These are all immigrant issues because we are an immigrant state and we need leadership and we need policies that is willing to say that and act on it. We believe at the Alliance in a New Jersey for all of us, regardless of immigration status. That's why we're here to talk about the Values Act and those top 5 things, Farrin, that you outlined at the start that the Values Act would achieve. Our state motto here in New Jersey, it's liberty and opportunity. It's time to deliver on those values. The Values Act is about exactly that, establishing critical protections so that every person is at liberty to access the programs and services that they're entitled to and pursue the opportunities that they want without fear of deportation and detention. That's the context that we're thinking about the Values Act in. Are our government systems welcoming? And is the way that our government works for people fair? As I mentioned earlier, New Jersey, we've made significant strides in expanding access for and eligibility for key state programs, but family separation is still a very real threat here. No one should fear deportation as a consequence of visiting a health office. No one should fear arrest because they'll need to pass through school security on their way to their child's PTA appointment. No one should fear that they can't report wage theft or an abusive landlord because their records with local law enforcement may be open to ICE. We're forcing communities into isolation and marginalization when state policies are unwelcoming. And further, some of the consequences of harsh immigration enforcement mean that even when someone makes a grave mistake and when they are charged, convicted, and completely serve their time, they can be punished twice by ICE. They have an entire set of second consequences. And that is a system that is neither welcoming nor fair, which is why we're here. And we're really excited to have this conversation about fighting for the Values Act together.
Thank you, Amy. Our next question is for Helen Zamora-Bustos, the community organizer with Wind of the Spirit Immigrant Resource Center. And before I proceed, I just want to note that if people have questions, you can enter them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will hopefully have some time to address them after we hear from the panelists. So Helen is a community organizer at Wind of the Spirit Immigrant Resource Center, where she works with immigrant communities to ensure their access to information that will strengthen their leadership and will also allow them to realize their power as social and political actors. Helen, when we talk about creating a fair and welcoming New Jersey at its core, we're talking about how we can create inclusive and equitable communities where all people can live with dignity and respect and have confidence that they can access the programs and services that they need to thrive. I'm wondering if you can explain how the Values Act will impact confidence in public agencies within immigrant communities. Based on the work that you do, what is the current reality on the ground? And how will the Values Act impact the communities that Wind of the Spirit represents?
Claro que sí, Farrin. Muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad de hablar el día de hoy acerca del acta de valor para la comunidad. Bueno, la realidad es que en la actualidad, aunque hay un poquito más de confianza en cuanto a las agencias públicas, y siempre se mantiene un elemento de temor bastante marcado dentro de la comunidad inmigrante. La razón por la que eso sucede es porque históricamente hablando, así es como se han dado las cosas, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿qué sucede? No nos vamos muy lejos. Nomás en los últimos 2 años, en una situación que ha sido bastante marcada debido a la pandemia del COVID-19, la necesidad de la comunidad para accesar diferentes agencias para buscar no solamente recursos, sino para orientarse en cuestiones de educación, qué estaba pasando con la pandemia, cuáles eran los métodos de protección. Igual, no había una confianza para acercarnos a estas diferentes agencias, porque lo primero que pensamos es, estas personas tienen mi información personal, la información de mi familia. ¿Qué van a hacer con esa información? Si estas personas tienen acceso a mi información y yo voy por ayuda, o por alguna orientación, o por alguna información que necesito, en realidad la información que necesito pesa más que la seguridad de mi familia, ¿cuál va a ser la consecuencia? Y ahora, con más veras, con la situación de que gracias al trabajo y el esfuerzo de las diferentes organizaciones se aprobó la licencia para todos los residentes del estado de Nueva Jersey, sin importar su estatus migratorio. Entonces se añade una capa de miedo y de temor para estar por fuera, incluso simplemente en espacios públicos. Entonces, ¿qué sucede? Muchas personas de la comunidad lo que hacen es que se privan de información y de educación y orientación que necesitan verdaderamente para la salud y la seguridad de sus familias, porque siempre está el temor de qué se va a hacer con mi información. Si yo voy a este lugar, ¿cuáles son las consecuencias que vayan a poder ver? Entonces, la directiva de confianza es una medida temporal y aún así no cubre todas las necesidades de la comunidad inmigrante. Otro ejemplo claro y vivo. En este momento estamos en la implementación de el fondo de los trabajadores excluidos en el estado de Nueva Jersey. Un fondo por el que, de nuevo, se luchó bastante, las diferentes organizaciones estuvimos en conjunto para que se pudiera aprobar este fondo. Y aún así, todavía hay un elemento de temor dentro de la comunidad de tan siquiera hacer una aplicación para un fondo que claramente se necesita. De la necesidad de la comunidad nació la lucha, y aunque se pudo lograr algo, aún así hay mucho temor dentro de la comunidad para poder accesar a estos fondos que hay. ¿Por qué? Porque ¿qué van a hacer con mi información? ¿Cómo vamos a hacer eso? ¿Cómo nos vamos a proteger? ¿Qué va a pasar con nuestras familias? Porque ya ha habido un precedente. Entonces, no queremos perpetuar esa misma, no queremos que eso continúe pasando. Entonces, el acta de valor presentaría no solamente una ley establecida en el estado de Nueva Jersey para crear confianza, seguridad con la comunidad, sino que también estaría promoviendo una relación segura y de confianza con la fuerza de la policía y demás, si ellos están haciendo su trabajo y no están en colaboración con inmigración, porque de ahí viene el temor. El acta de valor también daría seguridad a la comunidad de accesar espacios públicos, de poder vivir en esos espacios públicos y no solamente tomar provecho de las oportunidades de agencias públicas, sino también tener la completa seguridad de que su información no será compartida con otras entidades que no tienen nada que ver con la información de ellos y de sus familias. También se prevendría la separación de familias, que obviamente es una prioridad para nosotros como inmigrantes e hijos e hijas de inmigrantes y demás. Y también, y me parece que esto es un elemento muy importante, al tener esa confianza con la fuerza de la policía, se establece una seguridad de si hay un crimen en contra de ellos o de incluso del que ellos fueron testigos, tener la confianza, voy a la fuerza de la policía, se va a hacer algo al respecto y yo no voy a ser victimizado. Yo no voy a ser el enemigo, sino que voy a colaborar con ellos. Entonces, esa es la realidad, es lo que hay, es lo que hemos visto y lo que queremos alcanzar en el futuro con el acta de valor. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Helen. So next, I'm going to turn to Charlene. Charlene Walker is the Executive Director of Faith in New Jersey, a multi-faith and multiracial network of faith leaders and faith communities working together to advance a social and economic justice agenda at the local, state, and federal level. Charlene, some may perceive immigrants' rights work as separate from the work of criminal legal reform and racial justice. Yet there are deep connections between these bodies of work. I'm wondering if you can provide a broad overview of crimmigration, the idea of a nexus between the criminal legal system and the immigration system as it functions in New Jersey, and expand upon how the Values Act impacts racial justice, particularly in light of a criminal legal and immigration system that is rife with racial disparities.
Hi, Farrin. Thank you so much for that question. I want to start by saying that I think it's important for us to acknowledge the role that language has played in dividing the criminal legal system and the immigration systems in our hearts and minds, and that it's actually by design. We are told to say detention, not jail or prison, when our loved ones are incarcerated due to the immigration legal system. The reality is, the minute a person is taken from their loved ones and their community, They are subjected to the cruel reality of incarceration. In the US, that means their incarceration will be a financial gain for some corporation or government entity. That means that those that benefit see our loved ones as dollars, and treating them with dignity is not a priority, as we've seen in the press. This separation allows those that benefit from the pain caused by this system to pit our communities against each other, when in fact, this is an issue that unites all of us. The reality is that the criminal legal system and immigration system are really different sides of the same coin that does nothing but cause harm to primarily Black and Brown communities. So crimmigration, it's a big fancy word, but it's really the place where two areas of law kind of collide. It's where the criminal legal system and our immigration system come together. It's actually relatively new, believe it or not, considering it really came into prevalence during my lifetime. And, you know, I'm young, regardless of what my niece tells me, that's 16. See, the way the system used to work once upon a time was if you made a mistake or you were accused of making a mistake, causing you to interact with the criminal legal system, you would go through that process. Decisions would be made. And when everything was completed, you would continue your life's journey in America. Then all of a sudden, political actors decided to shift things. And now non-citizens really face deportation for decades-old offenses that weren't even deportable at the time or current mistakes. An example is within Faith in New Jersey, one of our leaders made a tiny mistake for smoking cannabis, which is now legal, right? And they faced deportation years later after they had handled their matter. Mind you, in New Jersey, Black people were 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis than their white peers. It was infuriating for me to see this man of God that was a pillar in his community judged for one mistake, one moment in time. Imagine if each and every one of us could never move on from one mistake we made in our life. He had taken care of his matter, and he should have been free to follow whatever his life's purpose was. Yet ICE, they decided to penalize him, not once, but twice. Furthermore, we can't divorce the immigration legal system from racial justice. The media paints this false picture, right? That immigration only impacts one community. They tell us it's typically our Latino siblings. But the reality is, in this crimmigration system, it disproportionately impacts Black people. Currently, 1 in 10 Black people are immigrants. And in New Jersey, a Black person is 12 times more likely to be incarcerated in prison than a white New Jerseyan, which is unacceptable. According to a report from BAJI, prior to our census, Black immigrants only made up 7.25% of the US population. Yet 1 in every 5 people facing deportation on criminal grounds is a Black immigrant. 1 in 5. And at the time of their report, that translated to 35.7% ultimately being deported. That's huge. These facts, I think, are really important context for us to understand how crimmigration system actually plays out in Black and Brown communities. Because imagine, in order to reach these numbers, without the Values Act, we can end up with more policing in our communities, increased police interactions, and more types of law enforcement actually patrolling our streets. Already, due to New Jersey's relatively small size and proximity to ports of entry, the Customs and Border Patrol can actually flow throughout our neighborhoods. And without the Values Act, we make it easy for more Black and Brown folks to get swept up in the criminal legal system and torn from their families. The Values Act actually keeps all families together, no matter their immigrant status. It also helps us to center caring for our families and ensuring that resources are poured into our communities, not more law enforcement. I hope that helps to answer the question, Farrin, at least in the way in which I see it.
Thank you, Charlene. Next, I'm going to turn to Lauren Herman, the legal director at Make the Road, New Jersey. Lauren, as I mentioned, is the legal director at Make the Road with New Jersey, which builds the power of immigrant and working class communities to achieve dignity and respect. So, Lauren, I'm going to ask you a bit of a history question, recent history. In New Jersey, we've taken some first steps to disentangle law enforcement, criminal law enforcement, from federal immigration enforcement through the Attorney General's Immigrant Trust Directive. We're now aiming to strengthen those protections through the Values Act. I'm wondering if you can give us a broad overview of the history of the intersection between criminal law and immigration law in New Jersey, the development and impact of the Immigrant Trust Directive, and why we're here talking about taking additional steps beyond the Trust Directive now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Farrin. And thank you to all the folks who spoke before me. I feel like you all did a really great job of teeing up my piece, right? And so I think it's really important to keep all of that in context, where we've come from and the steps we've already taken, and then where we need to go. And in particular, thinking about what Charlene was just talking about why this is such a crucial racial justice issue. So the Values Act really takes the best intentions of some previous policies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Immigrant Trust Directive. So it takes the best intentions of the previous policies and pairs them with what we've been learning as a community about its implementation, so that we can strengthen these policies and increase protections for communities here in New Jersey. And so as I get into some of like the nitty gritty of how racial injustices and the criminal legal system interacts with the immigration system, I think it's helpful to know where we've come from. So the first directive in New Jersey that covered interaction between local law enforcement and federal immigration agencies was the Attorney General Directive 2007-3. And though I think it was well-intentioned, it permitted New Jersey officers to ask individuals about their immigration status. So when someone was stopped, if someone was stopped in a traffic stop, if someone was arrested, and it created a lot of fear and it created a lot of confusion. So officers were allowed to ask in almost all situations. They were required to ask in some situations, including for all indictable offenses, which we know in New Jersey can include really minor offenses, things that somebody might not think of as being a serious crime. Officers were allowed to ask about immigration status. So of course it created this chilling effect, right? I think Helen talked about this before, that immigrant communities were really afraid of any sort of interaction with local law enforcement, because it would have this exponential effect if it landed them in immigration custody. The AG Directive 2007-3 also allowed state officials to hold individuals in state custody, but beyond the time that they were allowed to be released, so that they could be transferred to ICE. The one protection in the directive was that it did prohibit law enforcement from inquiring about immigration status of victims. But one of the things that became really clear in practice was that this was a blurry line. And so under this previous directive, we heard stories. We would have folks coming into my office and sharing about how often survivors of domestic violence would call law enforcement if there was an incident, and they would end up getting arrested because the officers may have been confused about what was going on. And then they were asked about their immigration status and ultimately were referred to ICE. So this was really problematic. And in 2018, Attorney General Grewal issued the Immigrant Trust Directive. And the Trust Directive was put together after I would say pretty extensive consultation with community partners as well as with law enforcement partners across the state. It was a crucial first step in clarifying and limiting how local law enforcement should and could interact with federal immigration authorities. And I believe it received really broad support, right? Advocates were happy that these initial first steps were being taken. And I think many law enforcement agencies were happy for the clarity that it provided in terms of what their role was, what their lane was, and how they should go forward. So the Trust Directive in all of the Attorney General's communications about it, he explained that it really was built on the idea that all New Jerseyans are safer when the state's resources are directed towards community priorities and not towards helping the federal government to deport people. So there were several key pieces of the Trust Directive that limited local law enforcement's interaction with federal immigration. So local law enforcement under the Trust Directive, which is in effect right now, I should make clear, local law enforcement are not permitted to stop anybody, question anybody, search anybody, or detain anybody based on their immigration status. Local law enforcement are not allowed to ask about the status of an individual unless it's relevant to the investigation of an offense, right? So that's a pretty limited exception. Local law enforcement are not permitted to participate in immigration enforcement. They're not permitted to provide ICE access to local facilities, equipment, that sort of thing. And there are limitations, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the problems with this provision, but when local law enforcement can provide notice to ICE that somebody is going to be released. Another piece of the Trust Directive that I think has been really important is that local law enforcement have to inform individuals who are in state custody before an ICE interview. So the previous practice is that immigration officers would show up at a jail and ask to talk to someone, and the person wouldn't even necessarily know who they were talking to. So the ICE officer would come in and ask them all of these questions. What's your name? Where are you from? Where are you a citizen of? And essentially, the individual in custody would give over all of this information that the ICE officer needed to make a deportation case against that person. And the person had no idea that they were even talking to ICE. They thought maybe it was just another person from the jail. And so under the Trust Directive, local law enforcement has to provide written notice to the person that they're going to be interviewed by ICE, and that person has to give informed consent. Under the Trust Directive, local law enforcement is not allowed to hold a person who is detained for a minor offense and hand them over to ICE. And one of the proactive provisions in the Trust Directive is that law enforcement agencies have to create policies to receive requests for certifications for U visas and T visas. So those are two forms of immigration relief that are available for victims of crime and victims of human trafficking. And previously, whether or not law enforcement would sign a certification, that's a necessary step to move forward with those immigration applications, completely depended on where that person had been the victim of a crime, right? So certain jurisdictions would provide certifications, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. And other jurisdictions just refused to respond to requests at all. So that was a really important step to make it clear that local law enforcement wanted to provide support to these folks. A few pieces of the trust directive that didn't go far enough are that there was a pretty extensive list of criminal carve-outs, which have proven to be really problematic. Two additional pieces that we're hopeful that the Values Act will improve, will strengthen, are that the trust directive had really limited accountability mechanisms. So even if a law enforcement officer made a mistake and transferred someone to ICE when they weren't supposed to, there was nothing that they could do. There was no way to undo that. Once that person was in immigration custody, that was it. And the third piece that we're really hoping can be strengthened was around reporting. So although the Immigrant Trust Directive requires that local law enforcement agencies report on how they've complied with the trust directive, the data collected is very limited, and it makes it hard to understand what has actually happened. So some of the carve-outs that exist now under the trust directive are that individuals who have been charged with, convicted of violent or serious offenses can be handed over from local custody to immigration. If someone has a conviction in the past 5 years for an indictable crime, they can be turned over to immigration. And if someone is subject to a final order of removal, that is another exception within the protections of the trust directive. And I want to spend a minute on that last piece because there has been a lot of confusion about what constitutes a final order. And I think law enforcement in particular have been really confused about when they are able to contact ICE and when they're not. And, you know, to go back for one moment on the big picture, all of this, I think, is so important because we know that the primary way that people end up in immigration custody is through transfers from state and local criminal custody, right? There's this pathway, and it's the easiest way often for immigration agents to come in contact with local people. And so part of the goal with the trust directive and what we're hoping that the Values Act can do even better is to limit those transfers, right? To say that our state and local resources are not going to participate in handing folks over to immigration. We're not going to make their job easier for them. And yeah, so I think that that's it for my piece. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. That's a lot of details, but we look forward to hearing from folks in the audience.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So just a reminder, if those listening have any questions, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A section on the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, even just for clarification, because we're covering a lot of material in a short time today. And it sometimes helps. If you have a question, other people probably do as well. So we are going to, I think, bring all of the panelists onto the screen for the Q&A. I don't know if it's up yet. Okay, there we go. And we're going to take about 12 to 15 minutes, maybe about 12 minutes to go through some questions. So I'll just pause for one moment there in case people have questions they want to answer. Okay. Okay, so we'll get started. So first of all, There are two recent developments that I want to flag and kind of ask our panelists if they could talk a little bit about connections between this bill, the Values Act, and some recent developments that we've seen in immigrants' rights in the state of New Jersey. The first is and these both have to do with accessing essential services. So the first is the driver's license legislation that was passed in 2019. This legislation created access to driver's licenses for all qualified drivers in the state and access to state IDs regardless of federal immigration status. The second is, which I know some of our speakers referenced, I think Helen referenced earlier, is the economic justice campaign and the impact of the economic relief that was recently granted by our state. Again, the people who don't have immigration status to take advantage of federal relief for COVID-19. So others here can give more background on this, but my question is really, can you talk about how what we're trying to do, what our legislature is trying to do here with the Values Act connects to both either or both of these campaigns, these prior campaigns? And I will kind of open that up to any panelists who want to jump in. I can also give a target question if people prefer.
I could start. I think actually Lauren's comments at the end are a really helpful segue into this. I mean, Lauren did a great job explaining just how the clarity of the law looks on the side of public servants, right? For people to try and interpret the various carve-outs, the reporting mechanisms. And you can imagine for community members who for whom these programs are new and these eligibility criteria are new, who are also coming off the end of an extremely, just like flat out like racist federal administration, right? How people could have distrust in any sort of public program. When people are thinking about their own vulnerabilities, they're not splitting hairs between federal government, state government, and local government. The fears and the distress that the community is facing, these are like well earned, right? They're not misplaced, right? When Charlene talks about the racial disparities that are inherent in our criminal legal system, when we hear about the racial disparities that have happened across housing, healthcare, pandemic recovery, these are like earned mistrust, right? So when we're talking about the Values Act, it's not saying that it's erasing all of those experiences. It's saying we don't really need to add to the plate of things that people are fearful of because of their very real experiences. And as much as we want to expand services and expand eligibility, which is an effort that all of us are pursuing, we can only do that if we feel confident that they're going to have the intended impact in community, because people trust that when I access this program, nothing bad is going to happen to me.
Thank you, Amy. Just give one moment in case anyone else wants to weigh in, even just with specific examples or experiences that members have had.
Claro que sí. A mí me gustaría comentar, refiriendo lo que acaba de decir Amy y también lo que compartió Charlene durante su sección durante el panel. Es cierto, estas cosas son más que ganadas por el estado de Nueva Jersey. La desconfianza de la comunidad no es una cuestión de paranoia, es un miedo bastante bien fundado. Entonces, ¿qué sucede? El ejemplo de los fondos es un buen ejemplo porque es el más reciente, pero no nos vamos tan lejos en solamente cosas que han sucedido en el último año. Ejemplo, la asistencia para las personas con sus rentas, ¿verdad? Siempre que ha habido un tipo de elemento en cual esté incluida la comunidad inmigrante, siempre hay muchos peros. y más obstáculos que formas de facilitar el proceso. Por ejemplo, y me parece que es el más popular, que es una preocupación clara, no solamente en cuestiones de la fuerza policial comunicándose y colaborando con ICE, algo tan simple como la carga pública, ¿verdad? Hasta el momento de hoy, aunque la carga pública ya no está en vigencia, todas las personas, no puedo decir todas, pero en su mayoría voy a decir alrededor de un 80% de las personas con las que les ayudamos en cuestiones de asistencia de renta, que les dimos información en cuanto a la implementación de los fondos para los trabajadores excluidos, que les dimos información acerca de bancos de comida, que les dimos información acerca de clínicas para atender a su salud porque estábamos en la mitad de una pandemia. Siempre resulta de una familia o de otra, pero eso no me va a afectar si más adelante tengo la oportunidad de cambiar mi estatus migratorio. No, pero yo mejor sí necesito la asistencia de renta y sí necesito la ayuda de los fondos, pero prefiero no aplicar a esto porque siempre está este elemento de carga pública y yo no quiero perder la oportunidad de cambiar mi estatus migratorio. Eso es una forma bastante clara y muy, muy marcada, discriminada para con la comunidad de migrantes de si usted necesita un tipo de ayuda y la tenemos, usted queda por fuera. La tenemos, pero para usted no es. Y entonces ahora que ya no está el elemento de carga pública, todavía existe la desconfianza en aplicar para estos fondos, para los diferentes programas e incluso accesar a las diferentes agencias por una necesidad que ha sido básica, que ha explotado como consecuencia de una pandemia que los afectó a todos por igual, pero aún más a los que siempre están pagando un precio extra por ser una comunidad de personas de raza negra o por ser una minoría. Y eso simplemente no es justo.
Thank you, Helen. We have a question. We have a question in the chat. How can or the Q&A, excuse me, how can those of us who are just listening be of assistance to your organizations and to help in promoting passage of the Values Act? And I want to open up to the panelists to give some initial comments on that, and I have a few things I might add afterwards as well.
Well, I guess I can start. I think that it's really important, especially in the world that we're in, that every single one of us should have a political home. We should have a place to call home, to make sure that our values are being lived out in the public square and that we're constantly giving a moral mandate to those in power to tell them exactly what it is that we want and that what we need. So I think first and foremost, it's about giving a political home. So I think that we can probably share all of the links to our organizations for people to be able to sign up and to find out how to get more involved. And that could look like going to legislative visits. That could look like making phone calls. It looks like talking to your neighbors. It looks like bringing them in the room to talk about your shared concerns and to go tell your story in front of those that are going to make the decision ultimately on whether or not this legislation or anything that affects our lives actually passes.
Thank you, Charlene.
I know that there's some calls to action that we have at the end, and I see some helpful links being dropped into chat. And I think it's really important to take the information that you heard today, tell it to your legislator, right? We just came off this election where everyone has a very false perception about who New Jerseyans are and what the priorities are. They need to hear from you. We can email until we're blue in the face and they see, you know, our email signature at the end and they're like, them again. But when they hear from you, that's when change happens, right? And that's how we know we're going to win this fight, because each of us knows someone who's been impacted by these harmful policies. Each of us lives in a place where immigrant communities live. But unfortunately, there are still some legislators that just don't know that. And the data itself is not compelling to them. It's you on the phones. It's you in their inbox. It's you showing up to their office and telling them, this is a priority for me and the people that I love and the community that I'm a part of. So really encourage you to check into those links and build power with organizations that are in the fight, exactly as Charlene said. There's so many places across the state where people are talking about these issues. We can build that movement together.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, I think we're going to, let's see, we're at 6:54. So I'd like to, I think I'm gonna jump ahead and just give you, just to piggyback on what everyone has said, which I think is so powerful and so important in sort of framing how you can respond to this and how critical it is for the legislature to hear from you and your communities and your families and everyone who's aware of these issues and affected by them, because I think I think there was such a powerful statement made earlier that like this is a kitchen table issue. It's something that it might not be what legislators initially think of as being the bread and butter kind of issues that impact voters, but in New Jersey it is, because this is our community and so many people across our state, so many voters are impacted by immigration and our immigration and criminal justice policies. So these are really, really core and important issues, but it's so important for legislators to hear from us, to not just from us, not from people working on these issues or advocating on them, but from voters. And so I want to just flag a couple of very specific actions that you can take if you're interested in supporting the Values Act and calling for it to be passed. There's an action alert that I believe has been put in the chat, and there's a link to it. That's an action alert you can fill out online to send a message to legislators. As Amy said, call your lawmakers. If your lawmakers are already sponsoring this act, if you're represented by Assemblyperson Mukherjee or Senator Cryan, call them and thank them and let them know how important this is. If your lawmakers are not yet sponsoring this bill, call them and ask them to join and to sponsor the Values Act. That's S512-512-A1986, 1986. Get involved, as Charlene mentioned, in the organizations represented here or in our partner organizations who are also campaigning for this bill and supporting it through the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. And if you look at the webpage for the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, you can see the many organizations involved. And I'll just pause for one moment in case anyone has anything I've missed. Okay, so before we close, then I'd like to acknowledge the work of my colleagues who organized tonight's event. Ami Kachalia, who, as I mentioned, led this effort along with substantial contributions from Paloma Aguas, Sarah Fajardo, Molly Lindhurst, Andrea Long, Kate O, Natalie Otero Lopez, Allison Peltzman, Maya Raposo, among others. I want to give a huge thank you to our incredibly skilled interpreters, Aldo Reyes Sandys and Anais Velasquez Garay. And I want to thank a huge thank you also to our panelists for the incredibly thoughtful and deep work that they have put into these issues and into thinking through this, the support for this bill. And also they're really thoughtful and deep comments, powerful comments today. Thank you also to everyone who has joined us to learn more about this bill and to figure out how you can get involved. Please stay tuned. We will be having more events on the Values Act and other campaigns in the near future. And we thank you for joining us today.